Fran was asked to introduce me. I indicated that I thought that was unnecessary. Thought that was unnecessary looking at the list of names. There are some names here that do not immediately jump out at me, but I think almost everybody knows who I am, for better or for worse. I ask that people not sit in the front two rows so that I can move around a little bit. Those of you, again, who remember my style is I have difficulty sitting still, and this way it'll work a little better. Okay. People were already asking me questions, how we all are, how on my end. Let me just fill some people in a little bit. You'll be able to see for yourself tomorrow if you were here tomorrow night. It turns out that the congregation in Beckley, West Virginia that Simone and I have been going to and doing services at the high holidays, COVID is raging in West Virginia, and so they canceled. They decided not, and so it turns out that meant I can help Tina tomorrow night and on Yom Kippur Day. Not so much tomorrow night, but on Yom Kippur. What you may have heard or you may not have heard, but just so that this isn't a surprise, we had a little adventure when we came back to Dayton last spring. You know, we always come back in the spring and the fall to see all of our kids, and for holidays, Simone had an aneurysm burst in her brain last March 15th. She's 99.99% back to herself. It's quite astounding. That was began to be true even 2 hours after they did the coiling surgery, a term I never knew of. I didn't even know what a neurointerventionist was until, fortunately, this all happened when we were in Dayton, because we live in the Oregon District half a mile from an ambulance and a mile from the Level 1 Trauma Center in the Dayton area. And a lot of good things happened, and there's many stories I could tell you, not the least of which they wouldn't let me into the hospital once she was in there because of COVID. There were all sorts of little things that went on in terms of all this, but the bottom line is she's 100% herself. If I hadn't told you, you wouldn't know the difference. Today she even had her eyes checked. She had residual double vision because her eyes were not moving in sync because the burst was right behind one of her eyes, but today she got the all clear from her eye doctor, so we seem to be okay now. Okay, are we ready now to talk about what we're here to talk about? So I got an email from Catherine indicating that this was a subject that people seem to want to know about. Frankly, it surprised me. This is a subject that those of you who were in my adult bar and bat mitzvah classes, we did talk about all of this. And like Aaron, anybody who was in my confirmation classes, we also talked about it there. These are subject matter that I love to talk about. But I didn't argue with you, did I, Catherine? I just said, sure, if that's what you want to do, if we can work out the dates, terrific. So we seem to have worked out the dates. Okay? So here's the approach that I want to use. I believe that way too much of modern Judaism is geared, I call it Pediatric Judaism. It is geared towards children, because we all know that synagogues operate on calendars that are based upon religious school, and we're all concerned about the next generation, and we want to make sure that they get a foundation, and so we're very, very rightly so concerned about that. However, what that does is it leaves us sort of only knowing what we learned in kindergarten. You remember that famous book? Which I'll tell you a little secret, is an absolute lie. You didn't learn everything you need to know in kindergarten. And the fact that caught on the way it did in the United States tells you about this kind of pediatric approach to everything. We didn't even come close to learning everything we need to know when we were kids, because we weren't capable of learning everything we needed to know when we're 5. And now I actually know what I'm talking about. We have 9 grandchildren, the oldest who is 13 and a half and the youngest who is 2. And I've watched them all go through this stage of 5, and currently our youngest, Aaron, he had 3 kids under 4 years old. He didn't learn that from us. But nevertheless, you didn't learn everything you needed to know when you were in kindergarten. And so what I'm trying to do here is to either re-expose you, if we've talked about this before, or expose you for the first time to some liberal adult ideas about Judaism and theology tonight in the next 3 weeks. Does that make sense? Are we all on the same page? Okay. So because that's my goal, I'm starting with Milton Steinberg. And by the way, where I'm getting this all from is this book. You have to be old like I am to know these kinds of books. This book, I think, was published in 1970 initially. And I was talking with a contemporary Jewish philosopher who'd never even heard this book the other day. This guy, Louis Jacobs, who was a non-Orthodox rabbi in England. You know, in England, they don't have Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. There's Orthodoxy, but then there's Reform, which is more like Conservative here, although not exactly. And there's Liberal, which is more like Reform here, although not exactly. First of all, everybody over there speaks British English, so therefore it's not exact. You know, we should never leave English to the Brits. They can barely understand what they say. Anyway, we watch a lot of British TV in Israel. So. But what Louis Jacobs did is, because he was thinking the way he was, he created this little book, Jewish Thoughts Today, in which he excerpts the significant thinkers of his time. Okay. By the way, he has one of these books on Jewish mysticism and one of these books on Midrash, all sorts of things. If you want to look into it, I'm sure you can probably find them for next to nothing used on in Amazon, if you want to look up Louis Jacobs. Okay, so I want to start with Milton Steinberg. Does everybody have that one? The goal tonight is to get through Milton Steinberg and a little bit of Abraham Joshua Heschel. I can't do justice to anybody, but we can at least teach a main idea or two for each of them. Does everybody have that one? Because Joel should have handed out two. Did you do that, Joel? Right, that's probably. Okay. Okay, so Milton Steinberg, you see, died very young. He lived from 1903 to 1950, which was sort of tragic because he was a significant thinker, rabbi, preacher, author. You may have encountered him. He wrote a little book called As a Driven Leaf, which was his famous novel about Elisha ben Abuya, who is the famous heretic in the rabbinic period. He wrote other kinds of things too. He wrote another little book called Basic Judaism. Lots of people used to use that book in conversion classes because what he tried to do was to boil Judaism down into a little book so that people who were being introduced to Judaism were not overwhelmed. And that book probably is also still out there someplace. Okay, so I'm going to read this. Let's see, and then, by the way, it's set up. If it's in bold print, it's him. If it's in light print, that's Louis Jacobs trying to help you understand what's in the bold print. We all still together? You all look like you're half asleep. No? Okay. How can I what? I can see your eyes and I can see which way your head is moving and all those kinds of things. Okay. Religion's world outlook centers about God. Before attempting to indicate what we mean by that word, let us first make clear what we do not mean. This is the essential starting point. God does not denote an old man on a throne somewhere up in the sky. That's the kindergartner's idea. Right? That's what a 5-year-old says. Unfortunately, if you ask most Jews, they may be a little more sophisticated about it, but if you give them a chance to talk a little bit, what do they tell you is their idea of God? Essentially an old man in the clouds in the sky. That's, if you will, God in charge. Sort of like up there, supervising everything, deciding what's what. It's not just Jews that have these ideas. That was Martin Luther's basic idea, right? That God is in charge. It's the basis of all Protestant Christianity. God is in charge. God supervises the world. There's lots of different terms for it, but it all boils down to the old man in the sky. Milton Steinberg wants you to understand, in his view, that's not what he thinks God means. That notion is in part a survival of the infancy of the human race. He doesn't pull any punches. In part a hangover from our personal childhood, from those days when, having first heard about God and possessing only limited intellectual resources. After he says that, how dare you think this thought? We pictorialize him according to our naivete. However, the conception has come by, it is far less innocent than is generally supposed. It impels many a person to regard himself as an atheist simply because he does not believe that there really is an old man in the heavens. On the other hand, it condemns individuals capable of ripe spirituality to the stuntedness, perhaps lifelong, of puerile, unsatisfying, and undignified convictions. Did you miss the point? Okay, so do we get what he's trying to say here? It's pretty straightforward, I think, but it's very important. I think it's very, very important. When all is said and done, you may not agree with where he ends up or with any of the other people that we're going to look at, but I want you to understand the broad range of possible ideas that are out there. So we started with a negative. God is not the old man in charge up on a cloud. That's kindergarten. Any questions about that? Okay, turn the page, please, to 4. Now, this should also sound familiar to you. Who was the guy here? There was a famous atheist in the United States, I've blanked out on his name, who essentially set the old man in the sky, God, up as a straw man, and that he built a whole career. His atheism was essentially saying, I don't believe that. How can anybody believe that? Yeah, Dawkins. He wasn't the only one, but for a while he was on the whole talk show circuit. Okay. To believe in God maturely, intelligently, is to believe that reality did not just happen, that it is no accident. No pointless interplay of matter and energy. It is to insist, rather, that things, including man's life, make sense and that they add up to something. It is to hold that the universe, physical and moral, is a cosmos and not an anarchy. What does he think a cosmos is? Cosmos is the opposite of anarchy, so therefore cosmos is organized. Anarchy is chaos. I think if I had written this, I would have said it is a cosmos and not a chaos. More alliteration, it would have sounded nice. Nobody's teaching me anywhere, though. So, okay. So, cosmos, not an anarchy, meaningful rather than mad, because it is the manifestation of a creating, sustaining, animating, design-lending spirit, a mind will, or to use the oldest and most familiar and best word, God. So what does Milton Steinberg think God is? Don't all talk at once. Say again, friend. Okay, so this came into parlance in late 20th century America as an idea called intelligent design. Remember that? Sadly, intelligent design, which has something to say for it, ended up being just a political move to try to get certain things into school curricula and certain other things out of it. And so you couldn't teach religion because of the separation of church and state, so you pretended that intelligent design was science. You remember all that stuff? And so therefore, they would try to teach intelligent design alongside of evolution as science. This still goes on in some schools. But this was really a big deal 20, 30 years ago. And it's unfortunate because the notion of intelligent design, or what Steinberg is arguing for, is fairly sophisticated. Now, when I was teaching the kids in confirmation class, I translated that paragraph we just read the following way into different English. Let's say that you walk home from school every day. Remember, I was teaching 15-year-olds. You walk home from school every day. That was hard enough for them to relate to. None of them did that. I walked home from school every day. Anyway, I say you walk home every day from school and you pass the same garden every single day. Every single day. And the garden is always the same, meaning there's the flowers are where they're supposed to be, and there's mulch all around them, and the grass is all cut, and there's a little stone path running through it, and it's weeded and all the rest of that. However, never, not even one time, no hints at all, do you ever see a gardener. No tools, no person, nothing that a person might leave, no direct evidence of a gardener at all. Is it more reasonable to believe the garden grows by itself that way, or that there is a gardener? Essentially, that's what Milton Steinberg is arguing. He knows that you cannot prove the existence of God. Anybody who has followed philosophy goes through this process in which, particularly after the Greeks, but even during the time of the Greeks, Aristotle did this, you get proofs for the existence of God. And they have fancy names. The teleological argument, the ontological argument, all these kinds of arguments which were intended to prove God existed. And then along came a guy named Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant wrote a book which I do not recommend you try to read unless you're a glutton for punishment, called The Critique of Pure Reason. And in the Critique of Pure Reason, there is a section called the Antinomies, in which he both proves the existence of God and the opposite, using logical structures. Now, anything that can be both proven true and false isn't. If you can prove the same proposition true and prove the with one set of reasoning and prove the same proposition false with another set of reasoning, it's false. And so Immanuel Kant sort of put to bed the notion that we can prove the existence of God using logical structures that would compel one to accept the existence of God. Right? An example of this is Aristotle's defined God as the first cause, right? The unmoved mover. Because if you go back in a chain of causes, the logic would say that there has to eventually have been a first cause. But then you can come along and say, why is that? Really, why is that? Maybe it just goes back infinitely. Just like it can go forward infinitely. You follow what I mean? You can't prove God's existence. However, Steinberg, knowing this, knowing his philosophy, doesn't try to prove God's existence. He tries to argue for God's existence. Namely, that it's more reasonable to believe in God than not to believe in God. As opposed to, I'm going to compel you to believe in God through the power of my reason. Do you get the difference? So that's why he's making an argument, not a proof. And he thinks that if you look at the world, you will be persuaded that there is a design. And there's no design without a designer. Now, believe me, this is not foolproof. If you want, let's say you want to focus in on chaos theory, you can come to the conclusion there's not much of a design to this. I mean, in my own amateurish way, I prefer to focus on macrophysics that seem to make sense to me rather than quantum physics which seems to say essentially everything is more or less random within certain parameters. Right? If you want to focus on that, his argument can come apart. Because that's why I use the example of the garden, which is a macro example. And he's going to do that too. If we look through, he's going to say that it makes more sense that there's a deity rather than a nullity behind everything. God is the only tenable explanation for the universe. And then he gets a little more sophisticated. He doesn't think it's a static garden. He thinks that the universe is dynamic, pulsating with energy, movement, life. It is creative, forever calling new things into being, from stars to solar system, breeds of animals, new ideas in the minds of men. It is rational in the sense that everything in it behaves according to law. Now, that's where quantum mechanics sort of gets into this, but electrons and protons according to the rules of their being, plants in harmony with their nature, animals after the pattern of their respective kind. In other words, rhinoceroses do not give birth to giraffes. Someone disagree? Right? No, everything seems to follow its order. And he thinks that's true for chemistry, physics, biology, psychology, the moral order as well. Every place there is design, predictable recurrence law. The universe, and here's where it gets really interesting for me. If you look at the top of page 5. The universe, furthermore, is purposive. Now, he's getting pretty far out there, don't you think? At least it is in some of its phases. And he points to these things in nature. Insects laying eggs where they have a chance to survive, right? If you're talking about humans, engineers design bridges for specific purposes, right? And he goes on giving example after example of this. And if there isn't, that's not enough. Not just creative, not just dynamic and rational and creative, purposive, but also conscious. He's claiming the universe is conscious. Now, what's the claim for that? We are conscious. Well, think of it this way. There isn't any wooden chairs in here. Imagine a wooden chair. A wooden chair. When you see the tree has the potential for that chair. Right? The chair, if you want to think of it, is in the tree already, even if no one ever makes a chair out of that tree. So it's kind of reasoning backwards. That's why I said it's an argument. It's not hard, fast logic. Spock would not be happy with it. But you reason backwards from chair to tree. The potential in wood is chair that you can sit in. All right, we're the chair. And we're conscious. Which means that the universe had to have the potential for consciousness, and we're the evidence. Right? So you can say that the universe is a conscious universe because it has produced a conscious being, at least us. Who knows what else is out there, but at least us. So he wants to argue that this design is very, very sophisticated. It's not simply that garden where all the flowers and the path are all in the right place. This design includes purpose, and this design includes consciousness, and right? And it's dynamic. It grows and it changes over time. In other words, he sees if the universe is a machine designed by a designer, it is the most sophisticated possible machine. Yes. I agree. You caught me in the little slide that I did, which is you can say the universe has the potential for consciousness. But I think he wants to say something more than that. If we look at that, Look at this. The universe further contains consciousness. It has produced man. At least in him, remember, this is long before feminism, and he dies in 1950. So we have to forgive him all of his sexism. It discloses intelligence, a thirst for truth, sensitivity to beauty, a desire for goodness, and man is a component of reality, whence it follows that no explanation of the entirety can be acceptable if it does not illumine the existence and nature of this most complex, challenging, and mysterious of its components. And he thinks, he didn't say this, but he thinks you have to ascribe consciousness to the universe to do that. You can't just ascribe potential consciousness, but in order to get the full explanation for humanity, you have to take it a step further. I'm not trying to convince you per se, I'm just trying to explain. The universe. So, if what you're saying, I do not believe he is saying that the universe is one big mind. I don't think he's saying that, because he doesn't have the basis to say that. But he also wants you to understand that it's not just a simple tinker toy machine, right? Which is what in the 19th century, if you remember logic. Even the early 20th century, logical positivists, that's what they wanted to do. They thought of the universe as mechanical. And all you had to do was figure out how to put this ball in motion to make this happen, that whole thing. He doesn't want you to think it's that simple. Amy? No. He would argue that that's an example of purposiveness. Yeah, but really, nobody here thinks that's all we are, right? Does anybody here think that we are only a collection of cells? No, but so that's his point, that it's a very sophisticated design. Well, we don't know, do we? No, the only reason that we know we're conscious is because that's what we call our existence. So we can ascribe that to bees. I mean, they do a lot of things that make it seem like they're conscious, right? But we don't know. Okay, I saw hands over here. Aaron. Well, he does. No, I agree with you. But he wants to argue that there is and his teacher, you're going to have to wait until, not this week, but I think next week, when we look at Mordecai Kaplan, who is his teacher, and then I think you'll understand what he means by it. But it's better if I wait and we look at Kaplan, and then I'll try to explain it. Yeah. Science describes the order of the universe. we aren't going to have time for this, but the only philosopher I know who actually addresses what you're saying is a guy named Baruch Spinoza. And I think he actually has the answer. I'm part of a minority of people who read philosophy that thinks that, but there's no time for him this time. All that I can say that is persuasive to me is the potential for it all over is there. That's persuasive to me. But all of you have pointed out how he may have gone too far. Okay. All right, let's finish this up. Did you want to say something, Lonnie? I thought I saw you waving your hand around. Okay. Peripheral vision. You know, after this whole thing happened with Simone, my eyes were on her for weeks, whether she was in front of me or not. You know, I think I've developed my peripheral vision considerably. Okay, so look at where Aaron left off. For such a universe, the religious theory is by far the best fit. Only it accounts at all adequately for the striking features just enumerated. Now, because he's a sophisticated guy, and I want to go as quickly as I can, turn the page. Or even at the bottom of the page. I'm sorry, the bottom of page 5. And this is the classic argument against everything he's just said. But what about the evil in the world? In other words, he's not going to ignore the counterposition. Can the God idea account for that? Not entirely, and not to anyone's complete satisfaction. This fact unquestionably counts against faith. Okay? Well, how much more direct could you be? You have counter-evidence. The biggest counter-evidence, as you guys were pointing out about the moral universe, is evil. The Holocaust is just a particular example, but we could pick all sorts of things, from diseases and natural disasters and wars and a million different things. They all fall into the same bucket. On the other hand, there are many interpretations of evil from the religious viewpoint whereby its existence can be reconciled partially, if not thoroughly, with the existence of God. None of which that I find persuasive, frankly. That's just me. Okay? But even if evil were a total mystery, this is what I love about him, is he takes it on head on which theology could not make so much as a dent. The God faith would still be indicated, for at the worst it leaves less unexplained than does its alternative. If the believer has his troubles with evil, the atheist has more and graver difficulties to contend with. Reality stumps him altogether, leaving him baffled not by one consideration, but by many, from the existence of natural law through the instinctual cunning of the insect, the bee, to the brain of the genius in the heart of the prophet. In other words, he's saying, if you don't believe there's a designer, how do you explain the design? That's a much bigger problem, in his view, than the counter-argument of the problem of evil, which is a monkey wrench in the design. Isn't it better to have the designer, and the monkey wrench, than to have the design and no explanation for the design at all? Do you follow his thinking? Okay. The second reason for belief in God is that man cannot live joyously, hopefully, healthily, perhaps not at all without it. Now, I don't know. One second. We'll talk about when we get to Heschel. I promise you we'll address that. Maybe not exactly the way you want, but we'll address it. I'll try to address it. Do you follow what he is saying? He is now making a move towards, this is good for us. Believing, even if it's based on reasonable argument as opposed to proof, is just better for you than not believing. You'll be happier. You'll be more fulfilled. Because if reality is devoid of point or purpose, then like everything else, human beings, are just part of the machine. And this is where you're exactly right, Aaron. he's then going to make the argument against what we usually call existentialism, particularly non-religious forms of existentialism. Somewhere along the line, all of you read Jean-Paul Sartre, or you read Albert Camus, which, by the way, these guys wrote great literature. Crappy philosophy, but great literature. No Exit is a great thing. The Stranger is a great thing. It talks about the human condition and points us in a way that only literature can do. But as philosophy, I defy you to read Being and Nothingness, which was Sartre's philosophical work. I guarantee you it will put you to sleep within a paragraph, because it's just nonsense. It's just words after words after words. And it's even worse, Being in Time. Heidegger's Being in Time is even worse. They made me read these things when I was an undergraduate, and I was too stupid to know any better. But do you follow what I mean? The argument from existentialists is there is no meaning. There is no purpose. All there is free choice, which they mean random. They mean random choice. So it doesn't matter what you choose, but because you're alive, you must choose. And then if you're really good at it, you can try to build some meaning for yourself. But there's no meaning, capital M, in the universe. And that's what he is saying here. He's saying if you don't accept the notion of some sort of design and designer, you're left with Sartre. You're left with the random universe that may have turned out to be a mechanical kind of wonder, but there's no ultimate meaning in it. You know, it's like, when all is said and done, how are we all going to end up? Dead. And is anything going to matter? I mean, that's the nihilism, he says, is waiting for you if you don't find anything he says persuasive. It's an interesting argument. By the way, I think there's a lot of truth to it. I think that there's truth. Look, existentialism, no offense, Aaron, is something that young people find interesting. Everybody I know who was interested in existentialism when they were an undergraduate, by the time they get into their 20s and they've lived some real life and had to make real choices, and yet they've moved on from those ideas. Because they're so unsatisfying and so unhelpful and so depressing. It's fun to be depressed when you're 18 or 19 and you're sitting in your dorm room talking with your roommate about life. You remember those things? We used to do that. I don't know if they do that anymore. Probably now everybody's staring at some screen and they have no idea that there's anybody else in the room with them. But we did. But it's not fun once you're an adult. These are not ideas that are intellectually or emotionally satisfying as you get older. So we're going to look at in a minute a form of religious existentialism. That'll be a little different thing. Okay? So, pretty much that's what I wanted to tell you about Steinberg and what his challenge is. Who has a question or comment? Joel. Wow, it's been 40 minutes and you have not said anything. I'm sorry, this is my fault, but I'm going to have to come close enough to actually hear you. That's a good question. All of these are great questions. Did everybody hear him? He said, in his conception of God, does he make room for the limited God concept? Limited God concept, he dies in 1950. That's not a term that's in his lexicon, because all that really develops in the 1960s and beyond. And when we get to Richard Rubinstein, we'll talk a little bit about how that grows out of thinking like his. Okay? But we can't do everything all at once. So the short answer is no, because that's not what he's not thinking of God as limited the way you mean it, which is, doesn't the problem of evil, and particularly the Holocaust, lead us to believe that God cannot be omnipotent? That's usually the way, because as Rubinstein says, to believe God is omnipotent and to know the history of the Holocaust leaves you with the unavoidable conclusion that God wanted the Holocaust to happen. because God did nothing to stop it. Now, you can take issue with whether God did nothing to stop it. We'll talk about that too, and how does God operate in the world and all those kinds of questions. But those are questions that come after him. What is he concerned about? He's concerned about that infantile, puerile view of religion, which he thinks is stunting religion so that American Jews don't think that they're religious because they don't believe in an old man in the sky. And you know what? When I grew up, this was true. You know, there were sociological studies. One was called the Lens Study. It was done in the early 1960s, if I remember right, that indicated something like 60% of liberal rabbis did not believe in God. And what that meant is they didn't believe in this God. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not arguing against that. I just don't think that's what he's about. So what you're suggesting, Felix, is a kind of psychological theology, which he sort of skirts around at the end, that we need theology to prevent us from living a meaningless life or feeling like we're living a meaningless life. And so therefore, but he doesn't want to think that we invented God for that reason. He thinks God, as he's talking about it, meaning these, for lack of a better word, these forces within reality, creativity, purposefulness, consciousness, all these things put together that create our universe, he calls God. So, you notice he also called it the mind idea at one point. He's growing out of that kind of Hermann Cohen German intellectual tradition about God as idea. But he doesn't want to just say God is simply an idea the way Cohen did. He wants to say God is all of these animating, moving, designing forces in reality. And when we get to Kaplan again, you'll see what his inspiration for that was. Are we okay? We're right on time, assuming 45 minutes on that. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that there aren't something lingering before we look to Abraham Joshua Heschel, which is entirely different kettle of fish. Whole different thing entirely, all different. Yeah. I think I'm following Aaron. He's saying, if we build meaning for ourselves, isn't that meaning more meaningful than simply recognizing the meaning that's out there? Is that close? If we build it for ourselves. And I think at a relatively early stage of adulthood, the notion of making the most of our choices, building meaning, is way more attractive than as we get older and we find out how limited those choices really are. And that things don't work out the way we thought, necessarily, or even hardly. Maybe I'm revealing too much about myself, but I think all of us go through this, right? You know, where the first time, I was really lucky when I was young, meaning every job that I really wanted, I got. Whether I was 13 and selling door to door, or my first rabbinic position, even my second rabbinic position. But then reality finally set in. And it turned out life doesn't work like that. Right? All of us have this kind of experience, I think, which is why we sort of back off from the notion that through our own choices we are going to build the meaning that we want. I think it actually comes from lived life as opposed to something intellectual. that changes for us. I think our emotions change. But that's just my take on it. Anybody else? Karen. I'm working really hard at remembering everybody's name. You may remember that I can't remember names anyway. So, and I was the walking cliche, I never forget a face. And, well, yeah, go ahead, Karen. Well, that's a really profound point. The assumption is that community is built out of choice. And isn't that the essence of the United States of America? I mean, and we're seeing what's wrong with that, in my view, my humble opinion. But the notion that community is simply a matter of what we build for ourselves, running up against, if I want to use a positive term, inherited community. If I want to use a negative term, I would say tribalism, because that's the alternative. You can see that clash. And that's what makes America an experiment. That's what we're trying to do. Now, this has never been done, to my knowledge, anywhere in history, the American experiment, in which you have tribes coming from everywhere who are trying to build a community in which the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Sadly, we've got two such tribes now. Okay, so let me move on to Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is much, much more famous and who has been in the news a lot lately. There was a special on him just on PBS the other night that I saw. Part of it anyway. And why is that? Is because he had a very close relationship with Martin Luther King. And somehow the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the whole history of going back, and they somehow rekindled interest in Martin Luther King and in all sorts of other visions of America. And so somehow they were running this thing on Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was absolutely committed. He taught at Jewish Theological Seminary. By the way, after he managed to get to the United States out of Europe, he was brought to the United States by none other than Hebrew Union College, and he taught in Cincinnati. This is going to be really hard for you to believe, but he was not comfortable in Cincinnati. And Cincinnati released him. Hebrew Union College released him, and he landed at Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, where he was a whole lot more comfortable as an Eastern European traditional Jew. This shouldn't be too hard to figure out. He had no recriminations against Hebrew College. They had been a big part in saving his life. But you remember classical Reform Judaism in the 40s and the 50s? He was completely a fish in the wrong tank there. And so he got himself to the right tank. And then he became one of the beloved teachers at Jewish Theological Seminary. His big rival was Mordechai Kaplan, who we're going to talk about later, who was also one of the beloved teachers. And either you were kind of a Kaplanian, which was ultimately led to Reconstructionism, or you were a Heschelian, and which was kind of viewed as a quasi-neo-Hasidish kind of thing. I don't think he was really Hasidish, but he came out of Eastern European Hasidish background. You should know how hard this is for me to say. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself for a second, which is after living most of every year for the last 6 years in the state of Israel, I have less and less tolerance for ultra-Orthodox Jews. Most recent antic of their part is the Bratzlavers. You know who the Bratzlavers are? In my view, they're the most crazy of all the Hasidim. They follow Nachman of Bratslav. He died a long time ago. They don't have a Rebbe. And one of their big things is to go to Uman, which is in Ukraine, if I'm remembering right, in Ukraine, at Rosh Hashanah they do things at his grave. And they go in tens of thousands, like more than 30,000 from Israel went. They leave, it's almost all men, they leave their wives and their family. They refuse to follow any rules. I was in favor of letting them out and not letting them back in, just so you'll know where I am, because when they came back in, more than 1,700 tested positive, and many of them were arrested for having false negative test documents that they had used to get on the plane. Yeah. So, living in Israel with ultra-Orthodox Jews is enough to make you anti-Semitic. It really is. At least for me. I should admit that because it's not nice. It's not nice, but I don't have contracts to renew anymore. And oh, absolutely. I highly recommend it. You should work only so you can retire. Anyway, so okay, let's talk now. Even though Heschel comes sort of out of that world, he was only sort of that world because he developed his own thinking, which was highly influential, particularly to all those conservative rabbis that studied with him, but way beyond. Because he was then also a social action Nick. He was very big with Martin Luther King, like I said, and so he had a whole following simply because he thought he was putting his religion in practice. But whether you agreed with him on his religious theological ideas, what you saw was this man marching with Martin Luther King and supporting him when he needed it and doing things representing the Jewish community at the highest level in the way we all wanted it to be represented. Those of us who are old enough to remember, right? Okay, so that's true. By the way, in Israel had a version of him. His name was Leibovich, whose philosophy and theology of Judaism I find abhorrent, frankly. He thought the entire bit of Judaism was obedience. That you had mitzvot, you obey them. No ifs, ands, or ahs, no questions, no understanding. You have mitzvot, you obey them. However, he was a great social action Nick. He was a guy because he felt that the mitzvot compelled him. And so he was like the conscience of the state of Israel in his public persona and what he wrote in newspapers and the protest things that he took, that he was involved with. And most Israelis only know Yeshayahu Leibovich that way. They've never read any of his thinking. Okay, so who is Heschel? That should be the second thing you've got. I was told that we got till 7. Is that right? Are we okay with that? Okay. So you can see how old this book is because it shows Heschel born in 1907 and not dead because this came out in 1970 and he died in 1972. Relatively young man. Okay. So here's the main idea that I want you to get from Heschel, but I need to give you a background. With Steinberg, he was arguing for reasonableness. So the human faculty he's appealing to is your ability to reason, your ability to think. Heschel comes out of an entirely or creates an entirely different tradition in which what matters is your experience. Not your reason, but your experience. When you start with experience, when that's your starting point for all of your thought, for all of your ideas, we call that existentialism. In other words, you start with existence, you start with experience, and you go from there. So he wants to talk about what experience matters. He's not going to try to argue, to persuade you that his idea is correct. He's going to appeal to your own experience, that when you hear what he says about experience, you're going to go, oh, I get that. And then you'll be receptive to where he wants to go with it. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So, here's his main idea. This, by the way, came out of a book called God in Search of Man, a very famous little book. 1955. So, wonder or radical amazement is the chief characteristic of the religious man's attitude towards history and nature. Again, we're going to have sexist language all the way through. One attitude is alien to his spirit, taking things for granted, regarding events as a natural course of things. To find an approximate cause of a phenomena is no answer to his ultimate wonder. He knows that there are laws that regulate the course of natural processes. He is aware of the regularity and pattern of things. He's talking directly to Milton Steinberg. Sure, there's design. Who cares? However, such knowledge fails to mitigate his sense of perpetual surprise at the fact that there are facts at all. Looking at the world, he would say, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." He's going to quote Psalms and prophets all the way through. He's very big on text. So what is the experience he wants to appeal to? What does he want you to say? Oh, I know what he's talking about. I've had that experience. He calls it radical amazement. So radical amazement is not simply being amazed. It's not simply thinking that something is awesome, as the kids say. Wonder. Radical amazement is being amazed that they're not at a given set of facts, but there are any facts. Think about that for a second. This is an attitude towards life, an experience that you can cultivate, which is being, what does the word radical mean? Yeah, it does mean, it also means deep. It's like profound. So he could have said profound amazement. In other words, the amazement that's underneath ordinary amazement. Right? That what it's really all about is cultivating an attitude so that all experience is amazing. All experience is amazing. That's why he quotes the Psalms. The Psalms are all about emotion, right? This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. What he wants to argue is what happens when you cultivate your sense of radical amazement. When you accentuate, work on developing your sense of being amazed. Where does that lead you? To God. It leads you to the existential experience of God, not the argument to convince you that there must be a mind idea, a mind God, an idea God. Note the actual experience of God. The pathway to that is cultivating your experience of radical amazement. This is sort of a hard idea. Well, I'm sure you'd be glad to know it, Aaron. It makes sense to me too. But that doesn't mean it's easy. Think about this. How do we actually live life? Do we actually live life with a sense of radical amazement? Most of the time, we just take everything for granted. Right? And he thinks that's the enemy of religion. Jewish religion is what we care, but he's writing for a general audience. So, yeah. No. That's a great question because we all understand peak moments. So for him, every moment is a peak moment. There are no peak moments. There's just moments. And everyone should be experienced through the lens of radical amazement. And what that does is as you cultivate this, he thinks, just like the psalmist, just like the prophets, you are led to the experience of God. No arguments. Just the experience of God. Now, I won't ask for a show of hands, but he's assuming that people can have an experience of God. Now, he would say that they aren't sufficiently radically amazed. Do you follow? Of course, what all these people are going to try to do is to show you that you might be having experiences that you didn't realize that you're having. You know, if we're expecting to experience God like you do in the movies, we're not going to have that experience. Although, lately the world has felt a lot like a chapter out of certain parts of the Bible, where it's burning in the west and flooding in the east, and there's disease and pestilence everywhere in the world. I mean, it sort of feels as if there's the old man up there saying, you know, it's kind of Zeus throwing thunderbolts down from Mount Olympus. It sometimes feels like that. But he would say that that's not really religion. What I'm trying to do is to sensitize you to the experiences you're having, and then you'll realize that those are of God. In this piece, he doesn't specifically say that, but I would think he would say that. I think he would say that. But you notice this is not, I'm going to ask God for something and then I have the experience if I get it. It's easy for me to, maybe, again, I'm too influenced by this because I just went through this personally. I believe that Simone and I actually experienced a miracle. She had a major bleed in her brain, and there's no, what the doctors call, no deficits. Isn't that a nice word? No deficits. As he said after he did the coiling procedure, he said, well, it was a success. And then he said to my daughter and I, we'll have to wait and see what happens, what the deficits are. You don't want to have this experience. Believe me, you do not want to have this experience. Anyhow, but so it's easy to start to think about experiencing God in those terms. You know, I could make a whole case that when 2 hours after the coiling procedure, Simone was waking up and pointing to get the damn thing out of her mouth and doing, you know, the whole neurological test. I can tell you the whole thing. You know, can you pull on my hands? Can you move your feet? Can you raise your hands up high? Once they got it out of their mouth, can you tell me who's president of the United States? That was easy. But, you know, all this kind of thing. And I could have said, this was an experience of God in the miracle. But the truth is, I don't believe that. What Heschel is saying, ordinary life, if you approach it properly, leads you to the experience of God. Not the so-called miraculous, because everything is miraculous. That there are facts at all. Yeah? I feel like that if you have to resort to, praising, accepting moments where you're experiencing God, that leads you to being a very Christian fundamentalist who think that there are games for God's things. You know that? No, I understand exactly what you're saying. I'm sorry to tell you that there are Jews who think that way too. They're not just, there are Jewish fundamentalists, and there's Islamic fundamentalists, and Hindu fundamentalists, and every kind has their version of it, who one way or another express those same ideas. Yeah, I don't think that's what he's going for. Yes, so we could use that word. He just chose radical amazement, okay, in terms of it. The guy was amazing. He spoke half a dozen languages and could write in all of them and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Look here on page 9. Does the worth of wonder merely consist in its being a stimulant to the acquisition of knowledge? Right? Isn't that the way scientific curiosity? No, he's going to say. Is wonder the same as curiosity? To the prophets, wonder is a form of thinking. It is not the beginning of knowledge, but an act that goes beyond knowledge. It does not come to an end when knowledge is acquired. It is an attitude that never ceases. There is no answer in the world to man's radical amazement. As civilization advances, the sense of wonder declines. Such decline is an alarming symptom of our state of mind. Mankind will not, I love this sentence, mankind will not perish for want of information, but only for want of appreciation. Except he died in 1972. All right. Right, no, but what he is saying here, think about that. We live in the information age, where information is the be-all and end-all of everything. And he is saying, it might be useful, but what really matters is appreciation. Yeah. But when you consider, like a primitive tribe took place, who had no clue about how the universe works, they were amazed all the time. We're talking about a different use of the word amazed. He thinks scientific curiosity leads to explanations that deal with that kind of amazement. He's talking about a gestalt, a kind of way of approaching the entire universe. Look at his next sentence. The beginning of our happiness lies in the understanding that life without wonder is not worth living. What we lack is not a will to believe, but a will to wonder. I agree with that. But his point is, why is the wrong question? Why is a perfectly okay question for certain things, but religiously, it's not the question. How is not the question. If you understand what he means by wonder as this kind of approach to life. Look on page 10. Awareness of the divine. Remember I said it leads you to God? Awareness of the divine begins with wonder. It is the result of what man does with his higher incomprehension. The greatest hindrance to such awareness is our adjustment to conventional notions, to mental cliches. Wonder, or radical amazement, the state of maladjustment to words and notions, is therefore a prerequisite for any authentic awareness of that which is, which he means God. This is why for Heschel, what matters is prayer. Now, I wish he was here for me to ask this. I was a first-year rabbinic student, living in Israel, trying to learn Hebrew, when we got word that he died. And I didn't really understand all the things that they were saying on TV. I mean, they reran every old interview with him and all the rest of it. But I would love to be able to ask him if by prayer he included petitionary prayer. Because that's the stumbling block for me, personally. Some of you may remember. I remember really fondly. So my last sermon that I did at Omega. By the way, that was about the most fun day I had all year round, all year when I was working here. Because when you speak at Omega, they're actually listening and responding. And here's the big thing, they want you to succeed. A different experience in the Jewish community. Except in Beckley. That's why we keep going back. In Beckley, where they had not just rabbinic students, Tina will appreciate this, but second-year rabbinic students for like 25 years. And they said to me after my first Rosh Hashanah service, they said to me, Rabbi, you're so relaxed. You're so seasoned. it looks like you're having fun. Like this. And I said, you're comparing me to second-year students after I've been in the rabbinate for 40 years? I would hope that there's something different. But anyway, at Omega, I decided to do something my last sermon, which was to take a risk. Omega was so much fun and so easy, and the relationship was so important, and there were plenty of things to talk about. But I did a whole sermon on petitionary prayer is not real prayer. I don't know if any of you remember this. I used a Mark Twain short story as a quote and a couple of other things. And I concluded that the only real prayer is praise. And what I didn't realize, it was like it tapped into the mother lode of Omega. I mean, I knew that they were about praise, but they also do a whole lot of petitionary prayer, up at the altar and all sorts of other things like that. They were literally on their feet. Now, I think I was pretty good, but they were not this good. They were on their feet, and Daryl Ward was standing up, literally cheering, shouting, "Tell him, Rabbi, tell him." And at one point, I finished, and he was going to wrap up the service, and Vanessa had to say to him, "You didn't take the offering. Take the offering. Take the offering." That's how wrapped up it was. But that was because for me, I was actually just doing myself. Real prayer is praise. Real prayer is praise. That's why I love Shabbat, because Shabbat really minimizes any kind of petitionary prayer. And even when you have it, like the ubiquitous, all-popular Misha Berach, which if you actually analyze that from a theological point of view, there are problems with it, in my view. But apart from that, even that has been interpreted in a kind of generalized way. But it's generally about praise, Shabbat, and holiness. This is my problem with the high holidays, which is way too much about petition for me. Way, way too much. See, as I said, these are all things that I didn't talk about when I was actually working, but you follow what I'm saying? It's every other sentence is asking God for something and using every tricky thing we can think of to get God to agree. If you don't care about us, remember Isaac. Isaac was willing to die for you, so do what we ask. That's the essence of Rosh Hashanah. If you think about Rosh Hashanah morning, why do we read the Akedah? All the way through, if you look at the Unatana Tokef prayer, all these things. Anyway, so I wonder what Heschel would have said, because he was a big-time davener. He was all into sorts of prayer. He has a great little monograph called Shabbat, the Sabbath. But probably his biggest important work is called The Prophets. And God in Search of Man, and there was another one he wrote. I think there might have been something like Man Searching for God. But I am not enough of a Heschel scholar to know where it is that he specifically wrote about petitionary prayer. I would love to know that. But I do know from here that when he's talking about praise, if you look at what continues here for the last couple minutes, who does he go to? He goes to the Bible over and over again. Look on page 10. The grandeur or mystery of being is not a particular puzzle to the mind, as, for example, the cause of volcanic eruptions. We do not have to go to the ends of reasoning to encounter it. Grandeur or mystery is something with which we are confronted everywhere all the time. Even the very act of thinking baffles our thinking. Just as every intelligible fact is, by virtue of it being a fact, there's too many people who don't know what a fact is, but being a fact, drunk with baffling aloofness. Does not mystery reign within reasoning, within perception, within explanation? Where is the self-understanding that can unfurl the marvel of our own thinking, that could explain the grace of our emptying the concrete with charms of abstraction? What formula could explain and solve the enigma of the very fact of thinking? It almost is like poetry when you read him. And so he says, what fills us with radical amazement is not the relations in which everything is embedded, but the fact that even the minimum of perception is the maximum of enigma. And then he's going to quote from Job and from Psalms. Come ye and behold the works of God, sublime is his dealing with the sons of men. More. What is man that thou shouldest be mindful of him, and the son of man that thou shouldest think of him? and more. I will give thanks unto thee, for I am fearfully and marvelously made. Wondrous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth exceedingly. You see what prayer is for him. These quoting from the Psalms, all in praise of what he believes he's been led to. The experience of God. The experience of God. Okay. He talks about miracles daily are with us. The goals of Jewish living is to experience commonplace deeds as spiritual adventures, to feel the hidden love and wisdom in all things. The rabbis remarked, I'm on the very end, the rabbis remarked, it is not written here who did wonders, but who does wonders. He did and still does wonders for us in every generation, as it is said, wondrous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth exceedingly. That's what I think worship is about. That's what I think services is about. Worship, praise, and the like. And I take inspiration from Heschel because he's the one who focused in on this, beginning this kind of existential Jewish thinking. Next time we're going to look at Martin Buber, who's going to carry the existential thinking further and in a harder to understand way. And we'll look at Mordechai Kaplan, which will circle us back a little bit to where we started with Steinberg, because Steinberg was Kaplan's teacher, and we'll see what bothered Mordechai Kaplan and what were those basic ideas that actually started a movement, ultimately, the Reconstructionist movement, although the Reconstructionist movement today is barely Kaplanian anymore. So we talk about Reconstructionists who are Orthodox Kaplanians, who are still part of his ideas. He wrote an important book called Judaism as a Civilization. You may have heard that book. And those ideas are very, very important if you want to understand lots of things about the way contemporary Judaism works, particularly contemporary American Judaism. Okay, we have a couple minutes. Who has questions, comments? Aaron. No, that's Martin Buber. It's Martin Buber. Yeah, you have to keep these guys straight. These guys who spoke German. You have to keep them straight. Yeah, Joel. No, okay. So here I'm going to have to just disagree with you. What a surprise. Anybody remember every Saturday morning for 12 years? What we need really is Tom to be sitting across from you, and then it would be better. No, so here's what I think his point is that the experience of radical amazement leads you towards God and produces within you a desire to praise God. There's no more to it than that. In other words, it's not like we have an ulterior motive in praising. This is not propitiatory praise. How do you like that for a 25-cent word? This is just praise. This is just worship because you think of God as the source. What is it? Look at the works that God has made. It's not that he really disagrees with Steinberg. He just thinks it's sort of irrelevant. Of course, once you have the experience of God, that's all you need. You know that that's the ground of the universe. And so we praise because we are led to it as opposed to wanting something from it. It's a very different thing. Well, have you been to Omega? Okay. What do they do? But you know what they call that part of the service? The praise part of the service. At the beginning where everybody is standing, and because for them that's what I didn't realize I was tapping into, is I'm sure they believe in petitionary prayer also. They found some of the things I said funny, and I said to them, You may not like what I'm about to say. I wanted to give them fair warning. But the praise part is so integral to it. They can't imagine beginning a service without 10 or 15 minutes of singing at the top of their lungs, praise, and they mean it. That's what makes it so interesting. It's not an act, right? That's, again, part of the issue in the Jewish community. We're very good actors. But actually tapping into this emotion is sort of hard, yeah. Oh, I think thanks is part of it. Absolutely part of it. You're absolutely right. And I have no argument with that at all. It just is the way I happen to express it. And I can tell you in March, that's exactly where I was. That's exactly where I was. And if you want to know, just if you're curious, the biggest help to me were my clergy friends. Some of you may remember them. They spoke at our retirement dinner. And my clergy friends who understood all this, didn't have to say anything. Because it turns out, on these matters, it doesn't matter whether you're an Episcopalian, Lutheran, or a Jew. It turns out all to be the same. So, who else? I knew that beforehand, but I actually experienced it. So, and I still experience that these people were there when I needed them. Anybody else want to add something to this? Yes. How you get there? I was with you until the end. Well, okay, so hold that thought. When we get to Mordechai Kaplan, that'll be very relevant. You have a comment, Aaron, and then we'll wrap this up. You notice he never used words like that. He never talked about omnipotence or omniscience or even really he assumes God is good. But what for Heschel, this is the richest form of life. It's about what, remember we're talking about human experience starting from an existential point of view. How do you have the richest human experience? How does your life have the greatest meaning? Right? Not by building it through your own choices. This is not Camus. This is, no exit was there's no way out of this. We have to build our own choices. He is saying, no, you are led to God through this process. And when you're led to God, then life is meaningful and rich and important, and you have to practice it. It doesn't just happen once and done. That's why Jews pray 3 times a day. That's why you get up in the morning and you say the Birkot HaShachar, you say the morning blessings, right? If you look at the morning blessings, what are they? They're all praise blessings. I mean, some of them are a little iffy, like thanking God for not making me a woman. But apart from those, you know what I'm getting at. And that's his point. That's why he's so into prayer, because he thinks this is what leads you to the experience that matters. Okay, so we're going to look at Martin Buber next time. I will do my best to try to get across to you what I think he was going for when he said I thou. Okay? And then we'll look at Mordecai Kaplan. Okay? If you decide to come back.